How did divisions within the colonies shape the course of the Revolutionary War? And this is really, I think, getting to the point that while the majority of the colonists were certainly in favor of the pushback and were involved in some way, shape, or form with the build up to the revolution, um, for a lot of them, it sort of took a while to come to grips with the fact that the sort of war had broken out and that this was now going to be sort of a full-fledged war of independence. Certainly very early on, where when the British started doing well against Washington and his troops, a lot of colonists probably wanted to take a wait and see sort of attitude because they didn't want to sort of throw their weight in full force behind the revolution, only to have it crushed and then be potentially subject to retaliation. But as time goes on and the war is becoming more successful, by the end of the conflict, you eventually have the majority of of the colonists being in favor of the Revolutionary War. But that doesn't mean that they're the only people. There's still, by the end of the war, about 20% who remain loyal to Great Britain, known as loyalists or Tories. And oftentimes they're going to be remaining loyal for pretty legitimate reasons. I mean, certainly a lot of them still would have considered themselves British and British subjects. Just as they had before the war. And it definitely takes a sort of big ideological shift to say suddenly we're this completely new separate people, especially when you have family members potentially who are living in Great Britain. A lot of them had business ties with Great Britain. Of course, Great Britain was very much through those sort of mercantilist policies the top trading partner with the colonies. So, they had to be okay with, potentially breaking those ties that their livelihoods were tied to. Um, and also just the fact that trying to remain loyal was something that they thought was important and didn't necessarily want to go along with the ideas of the revolution. Some of the people were those sort of new immigrant groups who felt like they were a little bit more protected by British and British laws than potentially what the revolutionaries wanted to do. So you had them sometimes joining the loyalist cause. But the majority of the revolution and the majority of the colonists were in some way, shape, or form supportive of it, or at the very least did not decide to leave after the conflict was over, as many of the loyalists do end up having to leave the new country and move to Canada or back to Great Britain. But during the conflict, there's still going to be a lot of bitter conflict between these two sides. There's going to be rivaling militias that are essentially going to be fighting against each other, and some people even kind of consider the Revolutionary War almost like a first civil war, because while you have the Revolutionary Army fighting against the British Army, you also had sort of loyalists fighting against revolutionaries, sometimes even just by neighborhood or house to house, or one town's militia versus another town's militia. So it became a very heated, widespread, sort of chaotic conflict, particularly because of that division. Of course, another sort of division within the colonies was sort of their relationship with American Indian groups. And American Indian groups, for the most part, are going to be backing the British in the conflict, even though they are going to be fighting on both sides. And you almost see a replay here of the American versions, or America's versions of the Seven Years' War, where the majority of American Indian groups backed the French because they realized that the French had more of their best interest in mind and weren't quite as hungry for their land. You see the exact same thing in this conflict. Remember, one of the sort of starting points of contention between the colonists and the British government was the proclamation of 1763, which said that they sort of put that cap at the Appalachian Mountains, where the settlers from the colonies were not supposed to cross over and impinge on American Indian lands, and that did not go unnoticed. And really, the American Indians realized that their best chance was to potentially sort of play these various sides against each other to benefit themselves and find ways to sort of cap the pressure that was increasingly incurring into their lands and areas of control. So that's why you see the American Indian nations also being very split in this decision. Some of them certainly backed the revolutionaries, but a lot of them did end up backing the British for that reason. Similarly split are going to be the black Americans. You do see a number of people who enslaved individuals using this as an opportunity to escape, using the chaos as a way to either enter into one of the armies under the essential promise that they're going to be granted their freedom, or escaping into a state that does not have slavery, or just escaping into a state or even up to Canada where they would not be pursued and put back into slavery. Once more, the British were a little bit closer to abolishing slavery at this point in time than the Americans were, and to a certain degree, this was sort of based on an effort to sort of pressure the colonists, particularly the southern slave owners, by sort of threatening that they were going to potentially free the slaves and encouraging those slaves to run away and join the British Army. They were hoping to harm the southern infrastructure, and that's one of the reasons also why after the war is over, Great Britain cracks down very heavily on the slave trade, not necessarily through a moral sense, but primarily to try to get back at the United States for having been victorious and feeling that it was a way to sort of harm the newly formed nation. But that being said, once more, you had a very much division where, for most black Americans, it probably didn't matter a whole lot whether they joined the revolutionaries or the British, as long as one avenue or another was going to lead to their personal freedom. That was obviously the most important thing to them, and not necessarily fighting for one ideological cause or the other. Just trying to find the war, and trying to find an avenue within the war to sort of benefit themselves, which a number of them were able to do. But unfortunately, by the end of the conflict, it seems like the institution itself and the practice itself is not going to be greatly altered or greatly changed. But grand told, you can definitely see that there are a number of divisions within sort of the colonies and society and the surrounding areas that are very much going to make the revolution a chaotic event, where you have lots of different conflicts and battles and shifting allegiances and loyalties throughout the entire course of the war, which is definitely going to make it to a lot of degree, sort of a very hectic conflict in a lot of ways. What do you see as the most pivotal turning points in the war? A lot of very good answers for this, covering sort of a lot of the twists and turns of the conflict. Some people started very early on with sort of the battles at Lexington and Concord or Bunker Hill, sort of showing that there was going to be continued resistance and warfare, and sort of escalating the conflict into a full-fledged war. Some people pointed to George Washington and his escape from New York. Good old movie reference there. But yeah, the ability to, sort of be able to learn that lesson that a straight-up military engagement with the British, especially early on, might not be a great idea, but the ability to escape across the Hudson River, not be captured, and not have his army captured, and be able to sort of continue the fight. Yeah, it's going to be very important for the continuation of the war, because if Washington ended up being captured there in New York, and it's very, very difficult to see how the war would have played out in the same way that it did. Of course, getting one of those very early victories, the Battle of Trenton in 1776, where they once more crossed over the Hudson and attacked that Hessian camp, or the Battle of Princeton shortly after. Some of these battles that sort of show that the fight's going to continue, and that even though the Revolutionary Army had suffered some defeats, that they weren't through yet, and was able to sort of bolster their spirits. The ability to sort of survive the terrible winter at Valley Forge, and once more just show that despite even the supplies running out and the terrible weather, that they were able to forge through, pun intended, and continue the battle. A lot of people pointed to the Battle of Saratoga as being a very important turning point in the conflict, where Horatio Gates is able to outmaneuver General Burgoyne and capture about 6,000 of his troops, capture Fort Ticonderoga, and really show that this was going to be a real fight for the British, that now one of their armies had been defeated in a more sort of traditional battle sense, and that, it was going to be a long, drawn-out war and conflict. And of course, a lot of people pointed to one of the results of this, the fact that sort of prompted the French to enter into the war in 1778 as being very, very important. Of course, they signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, and we'll be getting into more of this in the next question here. But definitely seeing the legitimacy that the French are going to provide, the fact that the French essentially are going to be starting another global conflict with the British that's going to be taxing the British's resources even more. Um, is all going to be very, very important to the eventual outcome. Some people pointed to the British decision to move the war to the south and how, even though it might have seemed like a good plan at the time, in the long run, it doesn't ultimately seem to help them all that much. And of course, culminating with the Battle of Yorktown, where of course General Cornwallis is sort of hemmed in between the Revolutionary Army and a French fleet, and is more or less forced to surrender the largest standing army that the British had in the colonies, which for the most part is going to be putting an end to the conflict and sort of achieving final victory. So all of those would be examples and sort of turning points and pivotal points in the war that you could have pointed out or brought up. So once more, great cross section of the conflict that I thought the class brought forward here. Why did American revolutionaries seek and accept aid from European monarchies? What advantages did European officers bring to the Revolutionary Army? Yeah, so this really goes into the impact that other European countries end up having on the Revolutionary War. I mean, the simplest explanation for why American revolutionaries decided to accept this aid was, for the most part, because they wanted to win the conflict. And they realized that there were certain things that they needed that these European countries and monarchies could provide. On the surface, it seems somewhat counterintuitive, right? That they had, in so much of the rhetoric and so forth, essentially decried sort of monarchies in general and that form of government. But of course, they were here very willing to accept that help and that support in order to achieve their independence from Great Britain. So what were some of the things that the colonists needed that they were able to look for in those European countries? The first is just sort of legitimacy. Of course, Great Britain was sort of after the Seven Years' War, the world's sort of largest superpower, and the fact that some of their greatest rivals would officially recognize the colonies as independent and the revolutionaries as independent was very, very impactful. The treaty that the United States is going to sign with France, the sort of the first treaty in U.S. history, is going to be very, very impactful in the conflict, and just that. From a global perspective, now Britain needs to sort of fear that more countries are going to be getting involved once their opponents is no longer simply in a sort of internal domestic dispute, but now it's becoming increasingly a larger dispute, and that's going to be a big risk for the British moving forward. Another thing that the revolutionaries are going to need are resources, money and cash to help fund the war effort. And France, Spain, the Netherlands, a lot of the countries that Great Britain had traditionally been in conflict with are going to be more than willing to put some money towards the war effort and put some money towards helping out the revolutionaries fighting back against the British. Sometimes this could be direct military aid. The French are going to send lots of ground troops to help the Revolutionary Army. The Spanish are going to be attacking forts in Florida and along the coast of, or up the Mississippi River, I should say, from Louisiana, which of course they still held and controlled at this point in time. So, yeah, a lot of sort of direct military aid, and that a lot of the sort of fighting on the ground that was taking place in the Americas was actually being conducted by French troops fighting alongside Washington and Greene and some of the other forces, particularly in the later stages of the conflict. The first few years are going to be definitely primarily the Revolutionary Army, but as time goes on, there's going to be more and more French support building and growing. Perhaps the most important aspect is going to be the naval component, where France is going to essentially be providing a navy for the war effort. There's going to be a few ships that are being built by the revolutionaries. There's going to be some, privateers, private ships that are going to be using to attack British ships, but nothing that could sort of challenge them in a one-on-one fight and break those blockades which had been imposed on the northern ports. But really, what the French are going to do is able to once more sort of take a regional North American conflict for the British and blow it into another world war because, the part that the British certainly thought was advantageous for them as far as having all these colonies and this very far-flung empire is also going to make them very vulnerable. So the French are going to be putting pressure on the British in Europe, in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, so that some of those forces and ships that were pretty much specifically assigned to blockade the ports and contribute to the war effort are now going to have to be sent back to the English Channel to make sure the French aren't going to be launching an attack on the British. They're going to have to be sent to the profitable British colonies in the Caribbean to make sure the French aren't going to be attacking there. They're going to have to be sent to India. So it's going to make the British have to stretch their resources even further. And of course, the sort of ultimate, victory is going to very much be dependent upon the French blocking the escape of Cornwallis's troops at Yorktown and making sure that he's going to have no choice but to surrender. Of course, the Revolutionary Army is also going to need training. So you see a lot of sort of individuals from various European countries are going to be coming over and participating in the war and training sort of the troops because a lot of them, were not professional soldiers. They were sort of everyday citizens in the colonies. Some of them might have had some militia training, but of course militias weren't militaries, right? They each had their own various ways of training and preparing and equipment and so forth. So there was not a lot of experience creating a holistic fighting force. And while that sort of scattered approach might have worked okay in some of those smaller engagements, some of those hit and run guerrilla warfare tactics earlier in the conflict, by the time you get into the later portions of the war and you are having more traditional battles, you are going to need to sort of have a certain level of sort of professional training to make sure that there's enough cohesion within your army and your force to actually be implementing the tactics and the strategies on the battlefield. So, for example, you have the Polish officer who volunteers his services for the artillery, Tusztez Kusyszenko. You have Friedrich von Steuben, a German who is volunteered to train a number of the troops for Washington, and of course you have the French Lafayette and Jean de Caleb are very much going to be influential in their own right, leading troops and playing pivotal roles in a number of the battles. So you have some pretty high-profile individuals from Europe are going to be contributing to the war effort and sort of helping get that military experience passed on to the Revolutionary Army at a point where they certainly are going to need it, particularly when they start being able to go sort of toe-to-toe with the British forces. Americans eventually won their independence from Great Britain, the world's most powerful empire. Explain how and why they were successful. Yeah, and that's one of the most interesting things to think about when you're looking at the Revolutionary War. The fact that the odds were so heavily stacked against the revolutionaries in this conflict. That the British had, recently defeated the French, sort of their biggest global rival. They had colonies, across the world. They had the world's, largest and most powerful navy. And the colonists had none of that at the beginning of the war, and they were incredibly outnumbered, they were incredibly outmatched, incredibly outgunned, and how they were able to maneuver their way to successfully winning the war is pretty interesting to think about and contemplate. And it's actually, in a lot of ways, going to form a blueprint for future revolutions or conflicts against colonizing powers. That can be followed and utilized. So some of the aspects that are going to make this war possible. Washington learns very early on after the battle in New York that he for at least a while is going to need to avoid traditional warfare, that he's not just going to be able to line his troops up across from the British, march towards each other until they get really close, and then shoot and have one side standing, because he doesn't have as many troops, he doesn't have as many guns, and there's no way that that kind of a battle is going to be advantageous for him. So they're going to need to make sure that they break the war into smaller engagements, and that he realizes that he's doesn't need to win every battle. He doesn't need to win the war. He just needs to not lose the war. And this is really where the genius of sort of Washington's plan comes in. Is that realizing that you don't need to militarily defeat the entire British army. All you need to do is eventually make the British give up the will to fight. So make the war as long and as costly as possible until it makes sense for the larger power to essentially cut their losses. Um, and that's going to be the key. So you see him engaging particularly early on in those sort of smaller skirmishes like the Battle of Trenton, which is going to give them small victories, which is going to sort of help the morale and the cause, but is not going to necessarily put their army at risk of being captured or annihilated, making sure that regardless of where the war is going to go, from the sort of the north to the southern colonies, that you're constantly going to be putting that pressure on the British, and you're going to make sure that they're going to be having to constantly spend more and more money, more and more resources on the conflict. And of course, this is going to be a huge problem for the British, because the entire reason why the taxation started in the first place was because they had a lot of debt from a very costly war that they were trying to spend down. Now, are they not only not getting any of that revenue back from the colonies, instead they're having to spend a ton more money to fight another very costly war. And there's only so long as the British are going to be able to keep that up. Another big advantage is that the colonists are going to have the home field advantage, meaning that they're essentially going to be fighting in the colonies. They're going to be fighting in areas that they know well. They're going to know the terrain and the land a little bit better potentially. They're also going to have a more beneficial population around them, a more sympathetic population. Of course, we said by the end of the conflict, about 20% remain loyalists. About more than that are going to be probably neutral, and there's going to be a lot who are very much in favor of the revolution, but there's going to be far more in favor of the revolution than there are loyalists, and that's going to make it much easier for the troops and for the armies in the field. There's also definitely an enthusiasm gap. The British are fighting this with professional soldiers who don't necessarily have a lot in the fight themselves. They're essentially just fighting for a paycheck, whereas the revolutionaries are definitely fighting for ideals that they believe in, and that's going to very much make a difference, that they're going to be more willing to take risks. They're going to be more willing to sort of fight harder in certain circumstances, and it's definitely sort of going to give them that enthusiasm edge over the British. And you sort of see all these playing out throughout history from this time period forward, as colonialism is going to only expand in the 1800s into the early 1900s. You're going to see a lot of countries that are forced with fighting a larger imperial force copying these exact same tactics. You can see the Haitians use it in the Haitian Revolution. You can see the Maori using it against the British in New Zealand. And eventually, it's going to actually come back and sort of bite the United States, because this is going to be the exact same playbook that the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, or the South Vietnamese soldiers, or North Vietnamese soldiers fighting in the South, are going to be using in the Vietnam War. It's going to be the same thing. Non-traditional warfare. They're not going to try to win large-scale battles. They're just going to constantly keep the pressure up on the United States to make the war as long and costly as possible, until the United States essentially has to pull out because it's no longer worth the effort. So it's interesting how the playbook is sort of copied over and over throughout history, and while it worked very well for the United States in this instance, it's going to come back and certainly be a problem for them in their future conquests. Not to mention the Philippines, actually, before the Vietnam conflict. That's going to be another conflict that this playbook's going to be played out. And while the United States Army is going to be able to become more or less victorious in that conflict, it's still going to provide and become a much longer and costlier conflict than the U.S. had expected. So it's just something to think about. Of course, the British are going to very much also be hurt by the entrance of the French into the war, by making it not just a regional conflict, making it a global conflict. All the support that the French and other foreign powers are going to be giving to the revolutionaries, and that's really going to tip the scales decisively in the favor of the revolution And it's very difficult to see the revolution being successful without this help and without this aid. It's entirely likely that without the French, the war effort would have essentially run out of resources, run out of troops, run out of will to continue the fight on the revolution side. So I think, to a large degree, the United States owes France a pretty big debt of gratitude for the assistance that they received during this time period, because without it, it's relatively unlikely that the United States would have gained its independence at this point in time. Who knows what would have happened in the future. So yeah, those are some of the reasons why essentially a high school football team was able to take out an NFL team, if you want to think about how things looked at the beginning of the conflict, and pulled off one of the biggest upsets in history up till this point in time. What groups in America immediately benefited from the outcome of the revolution? What groups, could it be said, were not well served? In the end, how revolutionary, radical, or innovative, or groundbreaking was the American Revolution? And the class did a good job overall pointing out that the people who were sort of the most upset about the taxation and the policies of the British, the people who had sort of led the protests to begin with, the people who had been the officers and the delegates and the major participants in the war and the conflict, sort of the officer groups and so forth, the generals, that they were essentially going to be the people who immediately benefited the most. And for the most part, these are going to be the people who, coming into the conflict, were already at the top of the society. This was going to be the upper class. It was the wealthy merchants in the north. It was the plantation owners in the south. And that they were essentially going to now be able to just gain more political control and more authority for themselves. I mean, they had essentially been at the top to begin with, but now they sort of cut out Great Britain. There had always sort of been that thing hanging over their head, that while they essentially were the top dogs in society, that there were the nobles across the sea, and there was the British government, and sometimes the British government would mess around with their laws and their local assemblies and so forth. Now that was going to be completely cut out, and that they were going to have sort of all the power and all the control to really sort of form the new nation to best serve and best suit their interests. It could be argued that there were a few minority groups that gained small benefits through this process. Um, Essentially, we talked about how some enslaved individuals were able to use the chaos in the war to gain their independence, but most were going to have to wait for a longer period of time in order to gain those benefits. And it was only going to be slowly throughout time. Even poor whites were going to have to wait a while for them to get full equality and full voting rights and be able to participate in the government in the United States. So the primary beneficiaries are going to be the people who had sort of been pushing for separation and independence all along. And it's important to note that when you're thinking about sort of who is not well served, certainly some of the American Indian groups are very much going to not be well served by this conflict, that because essentially now that the proclamation of 1763 is out of play, there's going to be open floodgates into American Indian lands, and this time period on is just going to be increasing pressure and conflict on that front. Black Americans as well are going to essentially have to wait for any kind of substantial accounting of slavery to take place. Slavery is going to be written into the Constitution. It's going to be institutionalized in the United States. And there's really, at this point in time, not going to be a huge discussion or debate about it. So while some people were able to gain their independence through the war itself, after the war, that gate's going to pretty much be slammed shut. So when you're talking about how radical or revolutionary the revolution actually was, you really have to think about who you're talking about. Because for some people, it certainly was going to be incredibly revolutionary. It was going to be a huge upheaval in political and sort of economic structures that is going to be dictating some people's lives. On the other hand, some people are going to see very little to no change from the revolution. And their lives were not going to look terribly different after the revolution as they looked before the revolution. So it's important to note that the revolution in general was pretty conservative in nature. It was certainly a political and economic revolution. It was not a social revolution. So there was no interest or attempt by those leading the revolution to have any sort of mix-up within sort of the social structure. And they wanted to make sure that the social structure in the colonies was going to be maintained as firmly as possible throughout this process. You can compare that then, and we'll be learning more about the French Revolution, sort of the next big global revolution to take place, and that's going to be also political and economic revolution, but that's also going to be much more of a social revolution, and it's going to be sort of a lot more sort of chaotic and hectic in nature, and it ultimately is not going to lead to the results that a lot of people going into it would have hoped for. That's not necessarily saying it's because it was a social revolution, but that's the big difference, I would say, between the French and American revolutions, is how the American Revolution was able to take place with essentially maintaining a very sort of strict social hierarchy still in place, and the people who were going to benefit the most from it were the people who were at the top sort of throughout the entire process. And other groups, as we'll see in our document exercise, such as women and black Americans, are going to have a still long struggle ahead of them to try to gain more independence and more rights and the same freedoms that the sort of people at the top had been sort of fighting for themselves in the revolution.